1,000 years ago, people used smoke signals to communicate, right? Hala, you're in another town. I'm going to smoke signal you. I want to communicate with you. Today, I want to communicate with you and I text message you. The job to be done is the same. I want to communicate with you. The solution to do that has gone from smoke signals to text messages, but it's still the same job. Make sense?
You're watching Young and Profiting Podcast on YouTube. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Hala Taha, and on Young and Profiting Podcast, we investigate a new topic each week and interview some of the brightest minds in the world. Before we get started, hit the subscribe button and don't forget to click the bell icon to be notified every time we drop a new video. Hi, Tiffani. Welcome to Young and Profiting Podcast.
No, thank you for having me. I'm excited to be here today.
Me too. I feel like your career journey and all of your experiences are super relevant to my audience. So let's talk about who you are today. You are a Wall Street Journal bestselling author. You are also the chief growth evangelist at Salesforce, which is huge. You had an incredible journey so far. But I found out when I was doing research for this show that you actually grew up in Hawaii. And I believe that must have had a huge, component to who you are today, why you ended up going into the type of business that you went into, what your values are. So tell us about you growing up in Hawaii and how that kind of shaped you in terms of who you are today and what you do.
Such a great question, because I couldn't agree more. I mean, people often ask, what do I think shaped me the most about being an international business executive? It would absolutely be being born and raised in Hawaii, right? It taught me so much about culture. It taught me a lot about the different kinds of ways in which different people from around the world might do business and communicate. It was just a special place for so many reasons. I often say my childhood did not suck, right? It's like you learn about like what happens in the ocean, and then in the afternoon you get in a bus and you drive down and you go and look at the reef and you look at the fish, and then I want to know how the world was formed and volcanoes. You get on a plane, you fly to the Big Island, you see an active volcano. You want to see what it's like, where there's very light air and it's very cool and you're kind of at the tallest peak in the world from the bottom of the ocean to the top of that mountain. You get on a plane, you go to Maui and you go to Haleakala. So it was just really super special. I feel blessed to have been born and raised there and blessed to continue to go back all the time.
Yeah. So from my understanding, you were actually one of the only white kids in school, right? And then you went to Arizona State University and, you were one of probably all white kids at that school, basically, right? So talk to us about what that was like being a minority in Hawaii growing up. How did that shape your values, your perspective on life thereafter?
That's such an interesting question, right? After the last sort of year and a half we've had, I've often wondered what's the best way to say that without it sounding insensitive to the current environment that we're in, right? But sort of kindergarten, first, second, third grade, I was definitely the only blonde in the school or in my class, but not in my school, right? It was predominantly from Pacific Rim, Asia Pacific, right? Japanese, Chinese, Thai, Vietnamese, Korean, and then you'll have Tahitian and Tongan and Samoan and Bali. I mean, it really just wrapped the Pacific Rim. And so, like I said, it gave me such an interesting perspective on culture. I didn't think anything was unusual. Kids usually don't. It's when you get older that people start, maybe adults or parents or others start to tell you these things that kids otherwise are like, I like, Sally, or I like Mika, or I like, whoever it might be. At the end of the day, we're just all human. And so, as I came to the mainland and went to Arizona State, it was a definite adjustment for me. But thankfully, I had traveled almost completely around the world before I was 18, not the US, but through Australia, New Zealand, Asia Pacific, Europe. And so it gave me this really great cultural perspective about what it's like to be raised in a country or a place where you don't have all we had in the US. A lot more empathy and compassion for the fact that we are blessed to be in this country, regardless of sort of the current political climate. At the end of the day, I'm always like, look, if you really think it's terrible here, get on an airplane and go check it out somewhere else, right? Where they control everything you do, right? Women can't drive, women can't vote, women, have to get chosen to be married, and you can't do this and you can't do that. And it's just so I feel like that entire experience made me have a lot more understanding, especially for the current environment we have today, on a global basis, but for sure in the US.
That's super interesting. And I guess my last question in terms of your childhood growing up in Hawaii and how it shaped you today is really like the work-life balance, because I imagine in Hawaii, they're a lot more laid back. And so I just wonder, like, did you take that on when you went to corporate? You had such a crazy career. Did you have a good work-life balance because of that experience, or what are your thoughts on that?
Often people don't believe I'm from Hawaii because they're like, are you sure you're not from New York? Right?
I know. That's why I was like, when you first got on, I was like, I just found out you're from Hawaii. I had no idea, because you would never know.
Yeah, and so I'd say this. I'd say the second I get on an airplane and fly myself back home and I get off that airplane, I don't honk. I'm not in a hurry, right? I got nowhere to be. It's on Hawaiian time, and so it is definitely a lot more laid back. And so I thankfully have the ability to sort of shift between the two. But I know without a doubt that had I just approached everything in business in that very laid back, comfortable, sort of friendly way, my career might have been significantly different. And, and so there is this balance between, when I'm home versus when I'm working, sort of what I may come off as, right? It's very sort of a matter of fact and to the point and direct, which is maybe not so aloha, if you will.
Yeah, it's so funny, and it's so cool how, you can come from all different backgrounds and kind of end up at the same place. You grew up in Hawaii, but you ended up being in America and being this, C-suite officer at Salesforce now. It's absolutely incredible. So let's talk about your career journey, because like I mentioned before, you went to Arizona State University. You had a major in public programs, I think a minor in pre-law. Almost everybody I talked to who's super successful now was going to be a lawyer and never ended up doing it. It's one of the most recurring themes that I see. It's so funny. But anyway, you didn't end up becoming a lawyer, clearly, and you went into business. And I know that it's graduation season. Lots of people are graduating. They're trying to figure out, how can I, land that corporate career? And a lot of people are graduating with majors that might not have a lot of opportunities. So I'd love to understand how you ended up getting into business when you were, let's start there, when you were public programs and pre-law as your majors.
Well, one of the things that completely shaped my career, and I say every time someone asks me this question, is everything I learned about business, I learned at the carnival. And people are going to go like, okay, what does that mean? Right. And so even you laugh, but literally the carnival. So my best friend's family, when I was growing up, owned the carnival in Hawaii and indoor arcades. I'm going to date this, right? But this is sort of the early 80s, 1980s. And so, if video games were not in the palm of your hand at that time, you had to go someplace to play video games. So it was sort of an indoor arcade and an outdoor carnival. And so at 15, 16, 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, I worked for the family, and I was sort of their other, it's called Hanai, which means extended family. I was sort of their Hanai daughter. And so I worked for that company for about 6 or 7 years. And the mom was one of the very first female presidents of YPO. And so I had a front row seat to a female executive who owned her own business, who ran the show, right, literally. And, her husband ran the carnivals. It was a family business for him from the early 1900s, actually. His grandfather started the carnivals there. And then she had the indoor arcade. So, I had this amazing experience of learning how to, like, something as simple as ordering a teddy bear. You'd think it's kind of easy, order a teddy bear. No, there are about 1,000 different plushes of that teddy bear, which impacts cost. And because you're in Hawaii, it has to be shipped in. So you have to make sure it's 3 weeks lead time. If you run out of teddy bears and you need them tomorrow, you're in trouble. Like, it's not like they can just fly them in right from someplace else and you get them in a half hour. It doesn't work that way in Hawaii, right? We are an island in the middle of the Pacific. So when I went to college, I wanted to do sort of business administration as my minor. It was kind of the middle of my sophomore year. My college counselor pulled me in, and let me be really clear, I was not a good student. I was an athlete, and so that was my way of sort of, always, that's where I stuck my energy. Let me just put it that way. And I was not a learner that was a read, write learner. I was a listen, watch learner. So it didn't work for school back then, right? You have to listen to a lecture, read a book, take a test. Really bad situation for me because it's just not the way I learn. So my college counselor called me in and said, yeah, business is not for you. We're going to have to pick another major, right? Or you're going to get yourself in trouble. We want you to graduate, kind of a thing. So we're going to have to find something. Now you got an A in this class, criminal justice. Why don't you pursue criminal justice pre-law under our public programs? I'm like, okay, and in my head, I was literally thinking, business isn't for me. Like, I've been running $1 million business for the last 7 years since I was 15. Like, okay, I get it. And so that's why I didn't graduate with an undergrad in business. It was just an accident that my college counselor was like, you may want to focus over there. So, whenever I get that letter of donating to the Alumni Association, I'm always like, didn't you tell me I wasn't going to be good in business? What that says is you never know, right? Sometimes people, counselors or whatever, especially in your college days, may not know what really excites you. And, it may be false, negatives in the fact that you're not doing well in a class. It could be all kinds of reasons, not interest, but just maybe the way you learn. And so, that's kind of that story. And I think it's really important because, I've been able to do well in business without an undergrad in business administration, nor do I have an MBA. So
I was just going to go into the fact that I was looking on your LinkedIn profile and I saw like Wharton, and then I noticed it said certificate. And I was thinking, oh my gosh, she's done all of this without an MBA. Before we get into that, we have a lot in common. Like, I actually did terribly in my undergrad as well. And same thing, I was just focused on getting experiences. I was on the cheerleading team. I was in my plays. I was in my sorority. And like you said, that doesn't just, because you get bad grades in undergrad doesn't mean that that's going to be the rest of your life. So if you're out there in college, remember that getting experiences and having real life skills is just as important as getting good grades. And I know lots of people who graduated with top grades in their undergrad who are like, doing multi-level marketing schemes right now and not doing too much with their life in terms of like growth. So let's go into really quick, like your opinion on an MBA. You are a top executive at Salesforce and you don't have an MBA. So do you think that that's required in today's age? Or do you feel like you can, it doesn't matter what kind of educational credentials that you have, you can make it either way? Like, what's your perspective on that?
My perspective is I think you can make it either way, right? There's lots of people who run some of the largest tech companies in the world that didn't graduate college. They dropped out and decided to be entrepreneurs and have done so much to change the world. So I think that education is important, but I don't think it's the only measure of whether you're going to be successful or not. That's kind of one and two, right? But for me, I knew in my way of learning that if I took my LSAT a number of times, which is the test you have to take to get into law school, and I did okay. But that taught me right away that I am not a good read a ton of stuff, memorize it, take a test, and do well kind of gal. If you want to share it with me and tell me a story about why this is what happens in the law, and then ask me about it 3 weeks later, I'm going to remember because the story stuck with me, right? And so once I knew that, I made a decision not to go on for my MBA. And at 21, I think that was a good idea anyway. And then I considered maybe going back when I turned 30 and saying, should I go back for my MBA? Like, to your point, because I want to kind of move up the ladder from an executive standpoint. And thankfully, I had a CEO who I was working for who invested in me and said, why don't you go take this Wharton Executive Certificate program? And so it was an 8 or 10 week program. We lived on campus. We did a whole workshop. You had to be a VP and above of a publicly traded company. And so, all of those things. And so I got the opportunity where people from Johnson & Johnson and Harley Davidson, and it was just such a great experience for me And once again, I walked out of there going, I'm glad I didn't get my MBA, like, because it was almost too academic for me, right? Like they would go through these exercises and my gut would say, that's not really the way I would do it, because I tried this one time, I tried that one time, it didn't work. And so I felt like it was a combination of somebody who had their MBA and myself. And so what I learned from that was that point forward, I always hired a partner, my sort of COO of the business I was running, to be that person who knew how to run the business in that very rigored way versus my much less so. Let me just say that.
Yeah,
right?
it's like you like to take a more creative approach or innovative approach to things, it sounds like.
And so that was my strength and non-strength, right? My non-strength, I partnered up with someone to do it, with me. And then I leaned into my strength.
One thing that I want to note to all of my listeners out there that I think is also key is the timing of getting your education. So when I was an undergrad, I feel like I actually wasn't ready for college, but then when I got my MBA, I ended up getting a 4.0 because I was so ready for the opportunity and just, in a different mindset, had different experiences. So I think timing is key too to everybody out there listening in. So let's talk about your corporate career, because you rose up the ranks pretty quickly. I mean, I think you were maybe less than 10 years into your career. You were already a director at Sprint, which is huge. Like we said, you have a great position at Salesforce now. You were a VP of several companies before that. So talk to us about why you think that you succeeded in your corporate career. What were some of the qualities? What were some of the things that you did that really helped you stand out? Because there's lots of people who get into corporate and move up either very slowly or don't move up at all.
So I'm going to qualify my answer here because it's different than it was back then. I have been in the corporate world, if you will, for about 30 years. So when I like to say that my 20s were, I don't know what I was going to do. I was having fun, and how do I pay my bills while still having fun, right? Then in my 30s, it was like, I need to get a job, and I need to become serious about my career, right? And then in my 40s, it was like I needed to take a bit of a break. And then in my 50s, which I am now, it was I wanted to find a way to sort of give back. And the reason why I give that context is because my 30s was I changed jobs every 18 months in my 30s. And at that time, that was considered a higher risk. Where now, millennials, it's like they change jobs and no one blinks. But back then it was like, well, wow, you've changed jobs 3 times in 3 years. What's wrong with you? Right? And I actually changed jobs for the following reasons. I would go into my employer and I'd say, hey, listen, I love working here. I love what I'm doing, but I'd like more responsibility. I'd like to challenge myself. At that time, I was an individual quota-bearing sales rep. And so I wanted to become a team lead or a sales manager or a sales VP. I wanted to kind of move up the ranks. And so I went to my management, my manager or my leadership team, and this is what I'd say. And so they gave the obligatory, we love having you work here. We value what we do. We'd hate to lose you, but we don't have anything right now. Give us 60 days and let us come back to you. I'd be like, okay, take the 60 days, right? I keep doing my job, right? And I was always hitting quota. I was great at what I did. And so at the end of 60 days, lo and behold, I didn't hear from them, right? So I would go and I'd sit down and I'd say, okay, it's been 60 days. What have we got to work with? And there was never an opportunity. So I'd leave. And every time I left, once again, as an individual quota-bearing sales rep, I increased my base pay. I increased my title. I increased my sphere of responsibility. So I forced the hand to say, am I going to stay at this business and hopefully 5 years from now I become a senior team lead or a director, or am I going to go force the hand and see if I can make it happen elsewhere? And that's what I did. So over my 30s, literally, I changed jobs. And every time I did that, I took on, as I said, a larger base. I almost doubled my income and I took on more responsibility. But along the way, I went from sales to then leading teams in marketing and then teams in customer service. So I all of a sudden got this chance to have a complete view of the customer facing roles. And I was in tech, which at the beginning of what we now, the World Wide Web, I'm doing it in air quotes, right? That back then I was a Loqua's beta client. I was Constant Contact's beta client. Like, I'm really dating this, that we were selling via chat and recurring revenue and hosting and domain names in a time where people were buying yellow page ads and billboards, right? And mailers. And so I was super early. But what that also taught me during that time, by the way, considering the topic and the theme of your podcast, I realized I was not an entrepreneur. Because that was like Mark Benioff starting Salesforce and Amazon starting and all these things starting. And I was in the thick of it, but it was just never going to be my path. I'm much better as an intrapreneur. So through my 30s, I did that. And then at my 40s, I said I was burnt. I'd gone 3.5 years not sleeping in my bed for 7 straight nights. You know, I was managing a ton of people. I'd grown a $300 million business within a Fortune 500 company, and I needed a break. So I took that break at 40, started working for Gartner Group, which is the world's largest IT industry consulting and analyst firm. And I now had to go from being a practitioner to an academic. And remember, we already talked about the fact that I'm not very good on the academic side. So I had to kind of fake being an academic. But by about year 3, I started to find my stride of how do you find data, communicate data, and really be able to persuade executives to think a little bit differently. And I got sort of better and better and better at that over time. And it really was the foundation of the career I'm in now. And so when I was at the end of my 40s, I said, I want to try to do something else. Salesforce showed up and said, we want you to keep doing exactly what you've been doing, but do it for us. And so it was a perfect creation of a role for me, and kind of a culmination of, 25 years of doing what I love, which is being an executive and running sales, service, and marketing.
Yeah, it sounds like it really all came full circle with the Salesforce job. So I want to go back to something that you just said that's really, really interesting. And that's that you knew that you weren't supposed to be an entrepreneur and that you felt like you're more successful as an intrapreneur. And I think this is really interesting because I think we're in a culture today where it's like side hustle culture. Everybody should start a business. It's so easy to start a business. And a lot of people out there, fail as new entrepreneurs because they're not actually, cut to be an entrepreneur. So talk about that. Tell us about your decision process in terms of, why you decided not to go out on your own and stay on this corporate path. Like, how did you make that decision? And talk to us about that.
Yeah, it was 3 times actually that it came up. And it was really at my big job changes. If you didn't notice, right, the end of my 20s and my 30s, I decided I need to get a job. Boom, at the end of my 30s, the beginning of my 40s, I'm like, I need to take a break. I'm completely and totally fried. I didn't even kind of recognize myself. I'd been really working too hard. In my 40s, right, I felt like I had achieved and sort of created a sort of voice that the market was interested in hearing. And then in my 50s, it was about sort of payback. So at each of those changes, I sat down and said, okay, should I break out on my own, right? Should I start my own consulting business? And should I just advise companies and go find 3 or 4 clients and just get very deep in there? Should I go work on the consulting side at a big 5 consulting house? Should I, there was all of these questions. So the last time I did it, I was in Australia, in Sydney, actually, sitting with a friend of mine, Naomi Simpson. She is a shark on Shark Tank Australia. She's Ernst & Young Entrepreneur of the Year. She's, for Australia, she's the most followed on LinkedIn. And, she is sort of it from an entrepreneurial standpoint. And we are friends. And so we were having dinner and we were through our first bottle of wine and she was talking to me about being an entrepreneur. And she was one that was like, you need to go out on your own. You can do this. You've got the, and by the end of the second bottle of wine, right, I was like, she goes, yeah, it's not for you. Because it was like, not because of the second bottle of wine, but because we'd really talked through it. And I uncovered that I am risk adverse, that I like the security of corporate America. It doesn't mean I wouldn't be successful. I'm sure I would, because I can hustle and I hustle now. And, even though my life is very different than it was 18 months ago, based on everything that we're going through, I had to hustle still in my own role to say, how do you stay when you're normally flying 275,000 miles a year, giving 100 keynotes on 6 continents? What do you do when you're sitting at home? Like, how do you recreate that? So I hustle in a different way, but I don't have to hustle for a paycheck. And that, I think, was the deciding factor for me. Now, who knows? All right, I'm 55 now. Maybe when I hit the next big milestone, I'll change my mind. But right now, that's kind of how I'm feeling.
Yeah, it's so interesting. And I mean, you're doing great either way. And I just want people to know out there that there's so many paths to success. There's not one path to success. You can be happy and successful doing, just about anything. You can make money doing just about anything. So let's talk about Growth IQ, because that is such a huge book out there. You're a Wall Street bestselling author. And in that book, you talk about 10 paths to grow your business. Before we go into some of those examples, I'd love for you to talk about why people have a challenge growing their business to begin with and why that's so important.
Yeah, I can tell you that the decade at Gartner, my role was to take what we called inquiry calls from customers from around the world. Some were startups, like we had 3 employees. We want to hire our first salesperson, to the largest tech companies in the world saying, we want to reorganize our 30,000 strong, selling organization and our 500,000 strong channel organization. What do you think we should do? So it was this large swath between, small startups all the way to enterprise 5 companies. And throughout that time, I took probably 300 or so calls a year. And so do that across, a decade. It was almost 4,500 calls I'd done. And it was a constant theme. Growth is getting harder. Sales is getting harder. It's getting much more difficult to be consistent and repeatable. What we were doing last year isn't working any longer. What should we be doing? And going back to me sort of figuring out how to be an academic and advising in that way when I've been an individual contributing executive, right, that had people underneath me. First couple of years, I just answered the question. This is what I think you should do. And about year 5, I realized I was probably doing a huge disservice. And I started to understand that the blanket answer was not correct for everybody. Now, why not? And so I kind of started to uncover the framework, if you will, for what ended up in Growth IQ. But the hardest thing about growth for me is people are always looking for the one thing to turn the corner. And the one thing about growth is it's never one thing. And I think that makes people uncomfortable. Like, I don't want 82 things I have to do to get my business back on track. Like, you got to give me some advice I can actually absorb and action Monday morning, right? Or in a week or 2 or 3, but it can't be, it's going to take me 3 years to do this massive transformation. And once I started to understand the power of how to pull the different levers that they had choices of out of those executives and understand what they were competing against and what their product portfolio was, that's when I really hit my stride, right? I started to have impact on helping design go-to-market models for AWS, for Microsoft, SAP, Oracle, Deutsche, Singtel, BT, IBM, VMware, Dell. I mean, really anybody who is a tech company. And that then was, I also didn't want to write a book, right? So during that time, everyone was like, you should be writing a book, kind of like you should be an entrepreneur. And so I didn't necessarily want to write the book because I am not a writer, right? I am a talker. So it took me a moment to get over that hurdle. But that was kind of the journey of, after all those conversations and all those strategy and advisory sessions with some of the largest and smallest, most impactful tech companies around, I started to see that my advice could help more at scale. And so how could I do that? The only way I could do that was a book.
Yeah. And I know that your book is so highly acclaimed, and I definitely want to dig into the 10 growth strategies that you outline in there. I think it would take too long to go through each one, but I thought I could kind of categorize them. So let's talk about how to grow your existing customer base, because I know that is so important and is kind of the foundation of everything. So what are the ways that we can grow our existing customer base?
Yeah. So one of the things I want to say about the book overall is, if you pick it up, Growth IQ, if you pick it up, it's not going to be revolutionary. You're not going to go, wow, I never thought of that. It was actually a modernization of growth strategies that have been around for decades, and in some cases, almost 100 years, if not a little more than that. So I modernized it using social, mobile, big data, cloud, AI, machine learning, right? All the things we now have at our disposal. And one of the areas, especially last year, when everything came to a screeching halt, I made a statement that I believe 2020 was the year of the existing customer and not necessarily the net new customer, right? Because you've already done a lot on CAC for your customer acquisition costs and getting them in the door. It's much less expensive to sell to the existing base. They're more loyal. They're more willing to forgive. They're more willing to try new products and services. They're more willing to be advocates for your brand. So if you can get them to buy just one more time, so usually I'd say to small businesses, if you could get every customer you have to buy one more time from you, would you not double your business? And if you're spending all your time and energy to go out to, 100 people who've never heard of you to convince them to buy from you, you could spend a third of your effort into your base and get them to buy one more time or more, or try a new product. So that customer base to me is that unmined gold. The gold miners came to the West looking for gold in the mountains, and they didn't say, we found gold in this hill. Now let's go find another hill. No, that's not what they said, right? They mined that hill until it was almost gone while someone else went out and looked for the next place they would mine for gold. It's the same in business. And that whole thought process came to me on a flight from San Francisco back to LA. I sat next to a small business owner. He had a $3.5 million textile company. And we were having this conversation because he was reading over my shoulder and asked me what I was doing and said I was writing a book. So I had to close my laptop and have this whole conversation with him. But I will tell you that was such an important nugget for me, so much so I included it in the book, that he had 100,000 customers and he was struggling to grow. But then when I asked him, how many of those customers bought from you this month? Didn't know. This quarter, didn't know. This year, didn't know. What's your most popular products? What's the net? And he knew nothing. And so I'm like, so you're just out there chasing net new business when you've already got this 100,000. So I said, whatever you take from me, out of everything I've just said to you, hire an intern. USC is right down the street. Find 3, have them come in, clean up your database, set something up. I'd love for it to be on Salesforce, but please get something. And then, get all that information in and start to love those customers you have. And I said, and I'd be surprised if you had more than 10,000 active, valid, clean sets of customer information out of that 100,000. And so he challenged me on it and he said, we're going to go to lunch in 30 days. And I'll tell you, we went to lunch and 30 days later, he hadn't done it yet. So, the thing out of this, is you can just lead executives, people, entrepreneurs, small business owners. But unfortunately, there's so much happening simultaneously that they spend very little time kind of planning the future because they're so in the now. And so that customer base penetration path that you mentioned is such a critical part of any organization's growth engine. No question.
Yeah. So interesting. Let's talk about the customer experience, because customer experience is key. Retention, keeping your customers is really, really important. Because like you said, you don't want to just be in the business of chasing and chasing. You want to keep and grow your customer base. So talk to us about churn and some of the best ways that we can improve our client experience and mitigate churn.
Yeah, so I'm going to go back to 2002 when I was the SVP for sales, marketing, and customer service at the US's largest web hosting company at the time. It was about 4 times the size of Rackspace. We almost bought Rackspace, actually. And we had recurring revenue, right? Web hosting, right? So someone's website. And that business is now called web.com. It used to be called Interland. Web.com took the shared business, the dedicated business became Peer 1, and a lot of our custom sort of IP got sold off to GoDaddy. And so during that time when we were selling hosting, at the end of the month, we would have this spike in churn. And if you understand anything about churn, right, you add 100 customers. If you're losing 10, the next month you have to add 110 just to sort of, keep it going. So you don't want the bucket to be losing customers as you're putting it in, because it puts more strain on your selling organization to make up for what you're losing from a revenue standpoint. So we'd get this spike in churn. We didn't know why. Now, this is long before very comprehensive CRM and AI and machine learning and analytics. Like, we were running the business on an Excel spreadsheet, a little bit of Post-it notes and some bubble gum, right? It was not as elegant as it is today. And I think I was using a single user version of Goldmine or Act, one or the other. Anyway, so we did some analysis and we realized that people's credit cards were expiring at the end of the month. So their website would go down, their email would stop, our customer service call center would spike on calls, and our churn would go up. Well, we didn't know that that's what was happening. As soon as we realized that's what it was, We ran a report. Whose credit card's going to expire in the next 90 days? Let's proactively communicate. You're going to lose your email or lose your website. Now, while it was only 2002, those early adopters in e-commerce, right, and even brochureware of their website, right, take what they had in their PowerPoint or in their brochure and just slap it online. But this is 2002, so it's almost 20 years ago. They didn't want their website to go down. As soon as we fixed that, what happened? Call center volume dropped, churn dropped. Now our sales were even exponentially more impactful. And so something that simple, right? And so I call it in the book not being like win your customers back in a defensive mode, but offensively getting ahead of them leaving you, which was that example, right? 90 days, getting them not to leave in the first place. Then you don't have to win them back, right?
Yeah.
They just are with you. And also they feel like you're paying attention and care enough about them that you don't want their website and email to be down. So, I give that as an example, but that ties, as you mentioned, Hala, right into customer experience. That the experience a customer has with you has implications into, how loyal they will be to you as a brand.
Yeah. So what's your guidance in terms of actually keeping your clients happy? Like, have you worked with like customer surveys and like NPS surveys? Like what do you suggest is the best way to keep your clients and customers happy?
So I'm going to go back to that same example. So there was something in the system that was not allowing the customer service call center agents to actually reactivate a customer when they'd call in and give their credit card. Okay. So remember, I have a churn problem, but customer service agents are taking the calls they need to reactivate. They basically had to open a ticket instead of instantaneous activation. And, back then we had control panel, it was Plesk at the time, which, powered a lot of what was happening from a user interface to websites, right? Provisioning sites, emails, and domains. And so I could not get the executive team to prioritize getting the customer service agents to be able to reactivate a site on the fly, right? Versus opening a ticket. I couldn't, no matter how I tried to persuade them, right? Sell them on the churn stories, sell them on everything I just shared with you. So I said, okay, I have an exercise because I was on the executive team. I said, once a month, all of you have to spend one day in the call center. No excuses. It wasn't but one day and it was fixed because the executive right, heard the client complaining that, what do you mean? I'm giving you my credit card. I don't want to wait 24 hours to be re-provisioned. We're just going to go take it somewhere else. And they realized like it was consistent that was the message, that it literally took, maybe 24 or 48 hours for the IT team, right, to recode that and change it and give permissions and all the things, train everybody, et cetera. But it took the executive sitting in. So going back to your question, right, it's Net Promoter is good for real time. It's telling you something, but executives have to get closer to the customer and closer to the employee, seeing them, now it's in a virtual environment, but we have lots of things opening up, but executives need to see it in real time, like, out in the wild. What does it look like? How do we fix it? And so I am a fan of surveys. I'm a fan of Net Promoter scores, of course, and customer satisfaction, but I'm much more of a fan of executives spending time with their people, their employees, to see how that interaction with a customer is either viewed by the customer, good or bad, and or viewed by the employee, good or bad. And so I often give Undercover Boss as a fun example. I'm sure you've watched it. Yes?
Yeah.
Paula?
Yeah.
Okay. So what do they do in the first 5 minutes of the show? After the introduction, right? They take the executive, they sit them down in a chair, and what do they do with them?
They disguise him.
They disguise them, right?
Yeah.
Okay. So that's 5 minutes of very expensive TV time, right? Prime time, prime channel in the US. And then they go out amongst their people. I would argue that they could go out undisguised and no one would recognize them anyway, because they never leave their desk. They never leave their desk. Because if you really watch the show, you're like, how do they not know that that's what their supply closet looks like behind their retail store, right? Like a Tasmanian devil has run through it and there's no tags on it. No one knows what inventory is there. They don't know what is damaged versus millions of dollars of asset, right, in inventory sitting back there. We don't know it's there. Or your people are getting hurt from picking up boxes and putting them in a delivery truck instead of putting a forklift on the back of the truck. Like, how do you not know that's what's going on in your business? And that happens when executives don't go out and and manage by wandering around, which is I'm going to give that to Tom Peters because that's his sort of moniker in Search of Excellence, which is the first business book I ever read in 1982. But that is a great example of get out there and you will have a much different perspective of what your employees and customers want from you.
Yeah. I want to ask one more question on client experience. So you have this quote, the fastest way to get customers to love your brand is to get your employees to love their job. And you call it the experience equation. Could you tell us about that?
So 10 paths to growth in Growth IQ, I missed employee. Didn't include it. I talked about it lightly, obviously, throughout the book, but I did not by any means give it the level of focus it required or should have gotten. So let me, in full vulnerable transparency, I missed it. Coming to Salesforce was a huge eye-opener for me to understand the power of that. And so I had a hypothesis, I would say, on stage all the time. I didn't think it was a coincidence that Salesforce was one of the best places to work. In 17 countries, it's number one. In the rest of the world, it's in the top 3. It's one of the most innovative in the companies in the world. This is all based on many lists, right? And we're the fastest growing enterprise software company. Okay, so is there a correlation or connection between really great place to work, inspires people to innovate more, all right, have more care in the product, so more people, and then you grow faster? So I went to our previous CMO, Tiffani Bova, and I said, I have a hypothesis. Would you help me prove it out? She said, sure. So we did a project with Forbes Insight, and lo and behold, we found that brands that had higher employee satisfaction, had higher customer experience scores, had faster growth rates, 1.8x faster growth rates. So for $1 billion brand, it's a $40 million impact. So if you're listening and you have $1 million brand, it still has meaningful impact, especially as you're growing, that if you have an unhappy employee dealing with a happy customer, it's a bad combination. If you have an unhappy customer dealing with an unhappy employee, also a bad combination. But if you have a happy employee dealing with an unhappy customer, you have a shot at turning it around. And if both are really happy, even better, right? And I think Zappos is a great example of how you can really instill that all the way to the right of the extreme of what that looks like, right? No roles, no rank, no authority, right? Everybody's sort of... And everything is about that customer experience, even if you sit on the phone for 8 hours. That's the extreme of it, right? And then you have companies that don't look at it that way at all. And so what we found in the research was brands are either hyper-focused on CX or customer experience or hyper-focused on EX, but rarely both. Both. And so that has been kind of the platform for the conversations today that I've been giving. We're in the middle.
What does EX stand for? Just to be clear, what does EX stand for? Employee experience. Employee experience, or so you're saying they're either focused on the client experience or the employee experience, but not both.
Correct. At the same time. Rarely does that happen, right? So an example would be your chief human resource officer or whoever you have that's responsible for hiring, sitting down with your chief marketing officer or your chief customer officer, whoever owns customer experience, and including IT to figure out, are we all on the same page? For those of you listening, how many times has that happened in your company? Not about who do we hire, but it's about once they're hired, what's their experience as an employee, and then also what's their experience as an alumni. Like you want them to refer good people to us. You want, lots of people boomerang back. And so you want them to have a great experience. And so, that was a US based study. Now we're on a global study right now in 7 countries across all sizes. And it's sort of going to be the foundation for the next book.
Yeah. It's so funny that we're having this conversation because I feel like these are all things that I'm thinking about so much for my business right now is the employee experience. I have 63 team members now. So it's a lot different than when we were just 10 people. And now I have to worry about all these personalities and how to keep everyone happy and productive and how to have a great culture and maintain that culture. And then the client experience, which is so as you scale, you have less. I used to, be able to hop on the call for 10 hours a week with my clients. I can't do that anymore. So how do you scale that, right? So always thinking about these questions too.
So anyone listening, right? If you're a small business startup entrepreneur and you're hiring your first, 5th, 10th, 64th employee, whatever it is, the decisions you make now, the systems you put in place, the processes you put in place, the culture and feeling you're trying to create, If you start when you're small, Mark Benioff started Salesforce with, a concept of give 1% of our time as employees. And when there was only 3, it was easy to do. And now there's, now that Slack is closed, I don't know what the number is now with how many employees we have. Maybe it's 75,000, but 1% of our time, 1% of our equity, and 1% of our software. And he made that decision day one. And so, or you could say Jeff Bezos, day one. It's never day 2. It's always day one. Now with a new CEO, it's sort of a play on day 2, but I think you get the point. And so however you start that business, look at those entrepreneurs that have done it that way. The value of understanding the power of those 2 things will be so important to you as you start to get to 1 million, 2 million, 5 million, 50 million, $100 million. You can't get there if you're churning people because it's a bad place to work.
I totally agree. So let's continue on with some of your growth strategies. Let's talk about products and services. How can we grow our business leveraging products and services? What are the different ways?
So I'm going to frame this in a concept called jobs to be done. I'm not sure, Hala, if you're familiar with that concept. Are you familiar with the concept jobs to be done?
No, I'd love to hear about it now.
Jobs to be done is, do people go to, it's Theodore Levitt, it's really his concept. Do people go to Home Depot or Lowe's to buy a 1/4-inch drill bit, or do they go to buy a 1/4-inch hole?
A hole.
That's right.
The solution.
Yes, that's right. That's right. But what they actually do is they actually buy the ability to hang a shelf or build a desk. That's what they really do, right? Because a hole for hole's sake, you're kind of like, okay, I got a hole in my wall that's 1/4-inch thick. Woohoo, right? You need to do something with it. So the job to be done, it's a great way for you to understand that, 1,000 years ago, people used smoke signals to communicate, right? Hala, you're in another town. I'm going to smoke signal you. I want to communicate with you. Today, I want to communicate with you and I text message you. The job to be done is the same. I want to communicate with you. The solution to do that has gone from smoke signals to text messages. But it's still the same job. Make sense? All right. So if you're a small business, if you're an entrepreneur, what job to be done are you trying to solve? So even if you think about Steve Jobs and the iPod, what was the job to be done? Well, I run 10 miles from my house and my radio station on my Walkman doesn't work. Or I have to listen to the same CD over and over and over again. Or I have to listen to the same tape. For those of you who are listening who don't know what those things are, look them up. But if you can think about what are the things that you can do, the job to be done was listen to music while I'm working out, or listen to music when I'm on a walk, or whatever it might be. The job to be done was the same, but how am I going to make it better? How am I going to make it 10,000 songs? How am I going to put the power in the hand of the listener instead of the radio station? And you can't run with 10 CDs for your run. So the job to be done was the same. The solution changed. So if you can understand and master that concept, like look it up, there's a ton of stuff on it. There's books on it. That if you can understand that if the job to be done is the same and the solution has shifted and you have a new solution, better, faster, better experience, better design, whatever it might be, that's where you double down. But if you don't understand the job to be done, I was just watching a video on, do you know why it's called I in front of iMac, iPod, iPad, iPhone?
No, I don't.
So the I was for, at the time, everyone wanted to be on the internet. So Mac. This Mac will get you on the internet. iMac, iPad, iPod, iPhone, right? But it was also about the connection with people, right? Having it be much more people-centered than technology-centered. And so those are the kinds, some of our greatest innovators we always use as examples have been very, very understanding of jobs to be done. And so that's what I would tell you when you're thinking about, should I develop a new product? Should I develop a new service? Should I keep investing in what I'm currently doing? Well, is it still solving the job to be done? Or has somebody changed the solution for the same job and you're no longer as relevant? So even your business, you're going to advertise in a magazine, you can advertise on Instagram.
Yeah.
Right? Are you going to, write an article for a magazine, or are you going to do a podcast? Like, it's still, I'm communicating my message. It's the same, but the solution has changed. And the solution is different generationally, right? So, the one thing we have working in our favor is now, because of the pandemic, every generation has become digital, right? Because you were forced into it. But that's a great way to frame it. So when thinking about launching new products and services, always keep in mind, are you putting a hole in the wall or are you hanging a shelf? And if you're trying to hang the shelf, you have to tell the story in a way that gets your potential customers and existing customers to understand the value of what it is you're providing.
Yeah, totally. I love that. I love that. Jobs to be done. So speaking of storytelling, I know that you believe that telling a story for your brand is imperative. And that's a great way to actually get people to buy in on your brand and what you're selling. So talk to us about the importance of storytelling in business and some of your tips there.
Yeah, so I would say that I realized maybe about, I guess it had to be maybe 10 years ago, that when I would give keynotes, I would ask people, if you want a copy of my slides, which they always did, you have to give me feedback on the presentation. And it couldn't be like, I enjoyed it, or like you had to say like, I disagreed with it, or I didn't like this, I didn't like that you did. And I started to hear a consistent stream that they thought I was a really good storyteller. And so the moment I started to get that kind of feedback, I doubled down on that as my superpower. And I realized that if I can deconstruct complicated concepts, like even just jobs to be done, right? Like I could have talked to you about how to develop a product strategy and a solution strategy, but why not back it up, give a really simple framework in a story that now whoever's listening to this, next time, if you are in a meeting and in your mind pops jobs to be done, I have done my job. Right? Like I have inspired you to, for a moment, right, think differently. And so there is huge power from persuasion, communication, the impact that you have. But I think many brands underestimate the power of the story about their company. Like, what do you do for your community? What are your values? What do you do for your employees and your customers? And how can you share that in a more broad way to the greater stakeholder and shareholder community? Because for me, right, business is the greatest platform for change, which is a Mark Benioff quote, and it has to be purpose over profit. And so if you can understand the purpose of your company, the value of your organization to the people who work there and the communities you serve and the schools where your kids go and your employees' kids go, like that has impact. And so storytell beyond, here's what my product is. It's the best in the world. And here's the speeds and feeds. And aren't I fantastic? No longer is as effective as what's the whole story of this brand? Where do you stand on issues? What are your values? Can I trust you? What do your employees think of your organization? Like, how have you treated them over the last 18 months? Like that goes a long way. So that complicates storytelling to be a lot more vulnerable and transparent about who you are, especially as entrepreneurs and startups. Like it's important to understand what your business stands for and who you are, and how do you leverage that in a way that tells your story so people want to buy from you, want to work from you, and want to partner with you.
Yeah, I feel like that summarizes so much of what we were just talking about. It fits perfectly because your employees can be your advocates, your clients can be your advocates, and it just kind of helps, especially if you're any sort of service-based business, that those referrals are so important and it just helps the overall experience. So we talked a lot about customer experience. We talked about product and services. The last area of growth strategies that I want to cover is working with other companies and even competitors. So talk to us about that and how we can grow our business in that way.
Yeah, so I grew up in what is known as the indirect channel. So that is brands that sell with and through partners. So the example I give is Heinz ketchup as an example. You cannot go to Heinz.com and buy ketchup. At least I don't think. I don't know since the pandemic. But before that, you could not go to Heinz and buy ketchup. You'd have to go to your local grocery store. So I grew up being that distributor that would buy from Heinz and sell to the grocery store, except in my case, it was technology, right? I get something from HP and then I would buy it out of distribution, right? And sell it to an end user customer. And then I started working in distribution. So I was that middleman between big brand and end user. And so I was one of the very first female channel chiefs for the large tech companies around the world. And that was really my platform. Indirect sales was what I know and what I knew, and sort of where I guess I really cut my teeth from a career perspective. Where brands get that wrong is, do I have to hire 10 more salespeople, or should I just partner? So I was 30. It was my very first sales job in software. I was the only sales rep. I was dialing for, dollars every day, 100 calls every day. And I was reading a magazine and it said, work with this value-added reseller. We'll, bring you what you, and I was like, what is a VAR? What is a value-added reseller? So I did some investigation, and lo and behold, I'm like, well, why am I dialing 100 people a day? Like, I'm going to go recruit like 5 VARs and have them sell for me. And all I have to do is recruit and train. And we literally 10x the business for the founder I was working for. And as soon as that happened, I was like, oh, I really like this. Then I went and worked for another software company, and then I worked for a VAR, and then I worked for an integrator, and then I worked for a distributor, and then I worked for a telco. And that was sort of where I, for sure, had my career success. Brands make the mistake of thinking they're going to partner with someone, and if we build it, they will come. Like, we've struck a deal with a big, like Walmart or Amazon or Target or something like that. And then you're like, we're going to sell, and they're like, they don't sell anything. So you have to figure out, a partner strategy requires a lot of time, patience, and investment, and people who kind of know what those levers are to pull. But on the flip side of that is the competitive side of partnering. You may not ever think to work with someone you compete with. So an example I use in the book is an airline industry. When I first started flying as a kid, you'd have to get off one airline, pick up your bag, go to another airline, check back in, and check in your bag. The only reason that worked together, now when you get on an airline, you fly to London, and I'm going to go on to Italy, and I'm going to, fly American Airlines into London and Air Italia into Italy. Now I don't have to do anything, right? My bag shows up in Italy. I can go from one gate to the other. That is competitors working together, right? American Airlines and Air Italia. But at the end of the day, if they hadn't done that, imagine what travel would be like for us as consumers. They had to do it. And now we've seen, an amazing forward movement on drugs, right? You've had drug manufacturers working with competitive drug manufacturers to solve the worst pandemic we've seen in 100 years. And so that is that co-opetition, right? Working with someone you might not otherwise work with, either because the customer demands it, like the travel example I gave, and or, there's something that happens from a societal standpoint where something absolutely has to be put together and built in sharing IP and sharing in the development of that. So don't always think you only are the only one that can develop it. Partnering, manufacturing, and the last example I'll give is Kylie Jenner. If Kylie was to have tried to build her business 50 years ago, she would have built her own R&D lab and manufacturing plant and packaging plant and everything. She didn't do that. She partnered for all of it. And so she got to, it depends, whose numbers you believe. But when I wrote the book and I used her as one of the stories, let's call it a $500 million brand. She had 12 employees. $500 million brand with 12 employees. Got to a, $1 billion faster than the top, cosmetic brands in the world. And she did it. Now, mind you, she has like 10 countries and followers, right? So you need that. But go back to the strategy of how she did it. She said, I'm going to partner to deliver it versus building it on my own. So that's sort of the power of partnerships, both intentional and then co-opetition in that way that I described.
Yeah, I love those examples. Thank you so much for sharing them. I love that you give actual case studies. It really helps to stick in the mind. I'm sure everybody's enjoying this conversation. So my last question to you in terms of growth strategies and growth IQ is really the fact that one of my biggest takeaways was that you can't do these in isolation, right? You have to layer them together, and it's really all about the timing as well. So talk to us about how to prioritize what strategies to use and the importance of realizing that it's not like a one solution is going to get you, on your way to success. You have to think of multiple things.
Yeah, it's not only so that there was two sort of aha moments for me for the book. One is this combination. And I said probably half hour ago, right? It's never one thing about growth. It's always multiple things. And that's this. It's never one growth path. You're always going to want a great customer experience. You're always going to want to not lose customers. You're always going to want to optimize the way that you sell. If you just pick those three, they're kind of consistent no matter which other path you pick, right? I'm going to launch new products. I'm going to enter a new market. So the combination of growth paths is the holy grail. It's which ones. It's very much like a Lego set, right? Sort of put it together, see what works, and then you may have to change it along the way. But the big one was Growth IQ is, as I sort of mentioned, that I'm a listen learner, visual learner, that the way I remember is through stories. So the book has 30 stories, 30 case studies, 2 positive use cases of each of those growth paths, and 1 cautionary tale. And so it gives a good example of, like the Kylie example I gave. It's quick, it's 4 pages, you can get the gist of it and move on to the next story. And so that was the way of me telling this without it being very academic and heavy in content and not a lot on the story side, going back to the power of stories. Mm-hmm. But the aha on it when I started to deconstruct those stories was the sequence or order in which you do those, make those decisions or make any decisions actually has the greatest impact on your ability to be successful. Example, if Netflix had started streaming in the US before they started mail order with DVDs and VHS, do you think they would have been as successful?
Probably not. Probably
and
not.
There's a reason
no.
why. We didn't all have high-speed internet in our homes at the time. We had VHS players and DVD players because Blockbuster had trained us to go get what we wanted, right? We had to drive there, drive home, put it in. So let's go back to jobs to be done for just 1 second. What was the job to be done? Entertain my family on a Friday night, watch a movie at home. That's the job to be done. The solution changed. I have to drive to Blockbuster, drive home, or I can choose it and it will mail to my house, saving me all that time. But I still get to watch a movie on Friday night. So if you take that job to be done, right, the solution changed, but the job was the same, right? Yep. And then you could say, right, applying it to a phone, watching it on your iPad, watching, right? It's still entertainment. Solution changes. I digressed. Sorry. Back to
I loved it. Connecting the dots there. I love it.
Yep. Back to the order in which you do things. So if they had just started with streaming, we all wouldn't have enjoyed it because we didn't have high-speed internet. Interestingly enough, Blockbuster had tried streaming almost a decade before Netflix, but found the same problem. Had they just hung on and started to give people an option as they started to get high speed, into their homes and say, well, you can come here or you can watch it on high speed, Netflix would not be Netflix. But they didn't hang on, right? And so when Netflix left the US and went to the mainland, I went to Europe, they didn't start with mail order because they already had high-speed internet because the market had shifted. So the order in which you do things has implications. McDonald's is another example I give. They went to all-day breakfast, which their customers, we all had been asking for over a decade. We want all-day breakfast, and they never did it. Finally, a new CEO came in and said, hey, we should do all-day breakfast. What a good idea. So if they had made that decision on a Friday and turned it on Monday, it would have failed because you can't cook burgers at the same temperature you can cook eggs. So they needed to add a grill, which meant they had to remodel the kitchens of 3,000 franchisees. Then they could launch all-day breakfast. So that's what I mean by sequence, the order in which you do things. If you hadn't reorganized the kitchen, the idea, which actually got them back to growth and gave them the best growth rates they'd had in well over a decade, would not have happened. If Netflix had started with streaming, we probably wouldn't have them around today as they are. So I give that to you as just because you have the right decision, is it the right timing? Is it the right, combination of things that you're doing? So that's why I say the one thing about growth is it's never one thing.
I absolutely adore that. Thank you so much. The last question I ask all my guests, and this is your opportunity to give us any sort of last gem, is what is your secret to profiting in life?
Trust the process. Trust the process. It's a short answer, but I gave you a lot of history on my career. Had I thought that I had to stay one place and move up and trust the fact that was going to happen, or did I bet on myself and change jobs? Not always moving up. Sometimes it was lateral. Sometimes it was down. Ultimately, I had to trust the process. And when you're young, you have no patience. You want it to be done. You want it all to be, perfect and ready. And as you get a little bit older, you realize that's rarely, if ever possible. So you have to trust the process that even if you try and fail, you will have learned something, right? You either win or learn. You never lose. So, I'd say trusting the process is absolutely the best piece of advice I can give anybody.
I completely concur. And where can our listeners go to learn more about you and everything that you do?
So Growth IQ is out in bookstores still and online. It's translated in 9 languages, which is just awesome. It's in Portuguese and Spanish, Korean, Simple Chinese, Mandarin. What am I missing? Polish, Vietnamese, Thai, and something else. Yeah. Anyway, so it's really cool to see it in other languages, because hopefully they translated it right and it has the same meaning. I have to trust that. So the book, What's Next, is my podcast with Tiffani Bova, where, I have some really amazing guests. I'm super active on LinkedIn and Twitter and Instagram. So follow me. Let me know what you think, what stood out, what you didn't agree with. I'm always open to a great conversation.
Awesome. And we'll definitely stick all your links in the show notes. I highly recommend her book, Growth IQ, her podcast, What's Next. Make sure you guys go check it out. Tiffani, thank you so much for all of your time and your wisdom. It was an absolute pleasure.
Oh, thank you, Olive, for having me. It was my pleasure being here.
Thanks for listening to Young and Profiting Podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please write us a review or comment on your favorite platform. Nothing makes us happier than reading your reviews. We'd love to hear what you think about the show. And don't forget to share this podcast with your friends, family, and on social media. I always repost, reshare, and support those who support us. You can find me on Instagram at Yap with Hala or LinkedIn. Just search for my name. It's Hala Taha. Big thanks to the Yap team as always. This is Hala signing off.